All right. Hi, guys. This video is going to go along with our intro to agriculture notes. So um, this should be the first page. And like it says, we are just going to kind of start our farming unit by looking kind of back in time and thinking about how farming started and a little bit about why it got to where it is today. So when we look back in time, it really all begins with what we call hunter and gatherer societies. So these types of society, back a long time ago, people pretty much survived by bringing wild fruits, nuts, and grains back to their camp. So they truly did go out and hunt and gather what they could in the surrounding environment. Eventually, at one point, they realized that they were actually able to control what they grew. All right. Okay, sorry for the interruption. So eventually they realized that they actually could control what they grew. So they started to plant the seeds from fruit that they liked best. And we call that selective breeding. So they were being very selective about the foods that they were breeding for themselves. So you can imagine how this would lead to much more permanent lifestyles. And they would oftentimes choose areas that were close to water sources because they realized the value of planting crops, which meant that they needed to wait for their crops to grow. So after many years, different groups became specialized in certain areas. So growing particular things, making particular things, even like not only growing food, but even like tools and things like that. So this really led to like the beginnings of what we call commerce, right? So selling or trading things. We see the development of technology, cities, social classes, and even eventually some political organization. So early traditional agriculture, everything was done by manpower or animal power. All of the cultivating, the harvesting, the storing, the distributing of crops, everything. They had no machinery. And this was all really early. So this was like before the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. So then the Industrial Revolution occurs, and you can imagine the massive change or shift that we see in agriculture. So for the first time, we have fossil fuel engines and large machinery that does the job like way faster and way more efficiently and way easier as well. So because of all those changes, we also see much improved irrigation, which is watering of fields, the use of synthetic fertilizers, and the use of chemical pesticides. And just so you know, the term pesticide refers to chemicals or things that kill pests, so mostly insects. So with all of these changes, we start to see better soil, fewer weeds, faster of the tilling and the seeding and the harvesting and all like the farm jobs, fewer pests eating the crops, and ultimately easier farming. So that all easier farming leads to more food. So continuously throughout the years and really the decades, we've just been able to successfully grow more and more and more and more food every single year. So with big farm machinery came big farms of one crop. So these if you Google the cost of some of these regular farm equipment, they're $1 million. I'm not kidding you. $500,000, $1 million or more. Unbelievably expensive, but also unbelievably specialized. So the same thing that harvests corn does not harvest soybean, for example. So they would literally have two separate harvesters. This type of farming where they grow one crop is called monoculture farming. So mono means one, and they're truly just growing like one crop. Some farmers will alternate maybe in the same field between two things. So now the biggies are corn and soybean. Monoculture farming is easier for the farmers, but it's not perfect. So if you imagine environmentally or ecologically, it greatly reduces the biodiversity over large areas. So if a farmer has a 200-acre plot of land, which isn't unheard of in Ohio, and they're doing 200 acres of soybeans this year, that's 200 acres that are just growing one plant, right? Nothing else lives there, literally nothing else. We don't want any other plant, any animal. We don't want them there. So it becomes this weird region of like massive lack of biodiversity, nothing else living there. Another piece of monoculture farming is that all the plants are genetically similar. So they're vulnerable to the same diseases and pests. So this poses the risk of catastrophic crop failure. So if you have 200 acres of soybean and all of a sudden a particular blight comes in, blight like a disease, plants and animals we are all susceptible to diseases and fungi and bacteria and bacterial infections, plants just as well as us. But so genetically, if they're so similar, if one field gets exposed to a particular disease, typically a farmer may lose the entire crop. So that's just one of the struggles that they may deal with. So from traditional farming, we kind of move on to the mid to late 1900s was what we call the Green Revolution. So with new technology and new crop varieties, and farming practices have become greatly advanced. So with the term Green Revolution, we think of like covered with plants, like growing lots of food, not environmentally friendly. So keep in mind that the Green Revolution in history was really like this big boom of farming, not necessarily green like we think today of being environmentally friendly. The first new strain was wheat that produced larger seed heads and short enough. So they had larger seed heads. The plant was short enough to avoid wind damage, and they resisted diseases and produced higher yields. So we got smarter with the crops that we were trying to grow and how we bred them. And we were able to see, like particular traits of a plant and breed them intentionally to have crop babies, plant babies that had those traits. So an example would be like I said, the wheat had bigger seed heads, which is ultimately what we harvest from wheat is the seed itself. Short enough plants so that big winds don't snap the plants over and break them. We began to realize how we could breed plants that were resistant to particular diseases and also just produced like more seeds as well. Because of this process, within 2 decades, Mexico had tripled its wheat production. So some, for example, some countries got really, really good and efficient at this, including the United States. We also started producing and using large amounts of synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides. We liberally irrigated crops and used huge equipment powered by fossil fuels. So the good news is that with the Green Revolution, this kind of farming saved millions of starving people around the globe, right? So we were able to produce way more food than ever before and feed more people than ever before. So we were feeding and saving livelihoods. But is this good environmentally? So the pros of the Green Revolution was that it fed a lot of people and it definitely increased crop efficiency. So we actually needed less farmland, right? So if we can grow more food on per acre, then we need less acres. So less deforestation, less habitat loss, and preserved biodiversity within those ecosystems. So those are the good things. Between 1900 and 2008, agriculture energy input increased by 7 7,000%. And what we mean by energy input is like the burning of the fossil fuels, right? Um, so huge. I mean, to increase by 7,000% is obviously a huge increase. Between 1961 and 2008, so about 50 years there, food production rose 150% and the population rose by 100. But the area used for agriculture only increased by 10%. So remember, even though we have more people on Earth than ever before. We're producing more food than ever before. But it is interesting to note the how efficient we became in that time period with the land that we are using to grow food. So we are able to be more efficient with the space used. The cons or the downfalls of the Green Revolution was that they had extremely high amounts of irrigating water, lots of synthetic fertilizers, lots of synthetic chemical pesticides. All of those things really lead to soil erosion, salinization, which is in regions where there's lots of farming, actually salt can build up. Desertification, eutrophication. So desertification is making a region void of any other plants. Eutrophication is because of the huge amount of fertilizers that we're using. We talked about this in the fall, but when we dump fertilizers that don't get sucked up by the crop, they make their way into the waterways and create huge algae blooms, and they're pretty devastating. Water and air pollution, and then of course, a large amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So is this type of farming sustainable? So the type of farming that we are familiar with today. I mean, that's funny. So what makes farming so hard? So some of the biggest stressors that they deal with is just unknown weather, constantly battling weeds, constantly battling pests, and then trying to like keep up with an unknown or maybe fluctuating demand for the crop that they're growing. So let's take a look at weather. So to cope, farmers put money into proper drainage. So if they get a big rain event, they want their field to be able to drain properly. Irrigation is the opposite. So they need to have a kind of like a guaranteed way to get, or means to get water out onto the field. And seed choice, huge one, huge. I mean, if you go to a farming community and you see those guys at a little cafe on the corner drinking coffee, they're going to be talking about and debating about, and they can get really heated about the company of soybean seed that they went with, the strain that they went with. It's a big deal. Seeds are, I mean, they pick and choose the seed type according to, now they've been genetically altered. So what are they going to be? Are they drought resistant? Are they flood resistant? Are they pest resistant? What are they actually been bred for? So nowadays, those are the three biggies that the farmers put money into. Weeds. So a weed is just any plant that grows that competes with the plant that they're trying to grow and harvest. So there's a couple different ways to manage weeds. The most common, obviously, is just conventional herbicides, which is just a chemical that they spray. So for example, in this picture, you can see that the crop they're obviously trying to grow are in these rows. They look like little pepper plants to me. And then you can see there's some weeds starting to grow like right here in the middle. So a typical farmer in the United States right now would have a chemical that they can douse that field in, and it will kill everything except their pepper plant. Okay. And oftentimes they literally buy the seeds of their pepper plant and the chemical hand in hand, and they know that they work together, and the herbicide doesn't kill their pepper plant. So most farmers are just spraying their fields to kill everything except the crop that they're trying to grow. An alternative that's used way less frequently is organic herbicides. So there are examples of organic herbicides, and we'll talk about that later. or just straight up pulling the weeds. So if you guys remember, I lived on 2 different organic farms, and I would say 70% of the time on these little organic family farms was just physically pulling weeds. I would spend an entire day, literally a whole day, 8 hours straight, just weeding. And I would make a tiny dent into the weeds. The biggest problem is, I'm not kidding you, a 1 week of untouched, an untouched area can allow the weeds to just totally take over the crop. So here's an example of how they apply conventional herbicides. So this is, like I said, what most farmers are doing. These are cheap, man-made chemicals that are sprayed to kill either a single species or everything. Most farmers are doing what the picture on the right shows, where they have a large piece of farm equipment that is designed specifically to spray a large area of their field in every pass with the chemical. Some are still doing it by hand, like on the bottom left. Organic herbicides are more expensive, but they're made of naturally occurring materials. Other examples are even just boiling water. So I've done that before, where I use boiling water to try to kill some weeds. Some people do like a water and vinegar mixture, or just salt water, actually soap water. So like a mixture of Dawn soap and water, cinnamon, and there's some various actual like organic chemicals you can purchase. Like this one on the bottom left is a thing you can buy probably at Ace Hardware today, an organic herbicide. And then again, just straight up weeding. So using the manpower to physically weed. I like the picture on I guess both of them. Well, on the picture on the right is very realistic to what I had on the organic farms that I lived on, because the weeds, within a week, the weeds would get so high, like in the picture here, you can hardly even see what they're trying to grow and what's the weeds. And that would happen. I mean, you would look at a row or like 5 rows of something, and the weeds were just totally covering the crops. You could see the temptation to just spray those weeds with chemicals and have them die, right? So much easier. The second thing was pests, so managing pests. So they use chemical pesticides, so similar to the herbicides, but the chemical pesticides just kill insects. So these are man-made chemicals that kill pests, and usually all insects at all life stages. So each year, 900 million pounds of chemical active ingredients from pesticides are applied. We use these very widely in the United States. 3/4 of them are used on agricultural land. Another example of pesticides that you guys may be familiar with is, a lot of people, you can buy your own sprays or have a company come spray your backyard for mosquitoes. That is great. And I think they are effective. I've never done it, but they kill everything, not just the mosquito larvae or the adult mosquitoes, but they literally kill any other insect that they come in contact with, which is not good. Since 1960, pesticide use has risen 4 times worldwide. We're using these like crazy. Similar to bacterial resistance, we're seeing this with pesticides. So we're seeing pesticide resistance is becoming not uncommon. So basically, you spray your field with a pesticide and it kills almost all of the insects, but a few are actually naturally resistant. Those few survive, they have babies, and they pass on the gene to be resistant. So slowly but surely within a field, the insects that are resistant to the chemical pesticide actually just keep having babies, and they keep surviving, and they keep having babies, and they keep surviving. So now what happens a few years later is the farmer actually has to increase the strength of that pesticide, right? Because it's not killing the insects on their field. And that's what we call pesticide resistance. Another alternative example is called biological pest control, and this is using living organisms to eat or infect pesky insects or weeds. Examples of this are parasitic wasps, something called BT, or predaceous insects. So on one of the farms that I lived on, we had just a huge greenhouse that was all tomatoes, and that was one of the many, many, many crops that we grew. And we would see tomatoes, if you look here at this picture, we would see tomatoes like this that looked like big bites were taken out of the actual fruit. And that is money, right? That's what the farmer tries to sell, obviously. And so those big bites were a sure sign that a tomato hornworm, which is this big caterpillar, you can see how big they are. I'm not kidding you, they're huge and juicy. So I would become obsessed with finding the tomato hornworms, and it was hard. They're amazingly camouflaged, but they would, so I would like, lift the leaves. And if I finally found one, I might find one in a day. I might find 5 in a day. And I would just launch them to the chickens on the farm, and the chickens would fight over that big juicy caterpillar. But eventually, maybe like 1 out of every 3 caterpillars looked like the picture on the right here. And so here's this big green tomato hornworm, and those white things are actually egg sacs from a parasitic wasp. So this is a parasitic wasp that only lays their eggs on tomato hornworms. So this caterpillar has been parasitized. The female came in and laid her eggs, as you can see here. Eventually, within like a number of hours, the eggs in those little egg sacs will emerge, but they'll actually emerge and go into the caterpillar first. And it's genius on that wasp because she knows that her babies are going to have a huge buffet their first meal. So they literally eat within hours. They literally eat that caterpillar from the inside out. Within a number of hours, all those eggs are in there, just eating her inside, the caterpillar's insides. And the caterpillar itself gets like really like looks like a deflated, floppy caterpillar. It's the coolest thing ever. However, you can get online, for example, and even like order some of these things, like a parasitic wasp. You can release them on your farm potentially to take care of the tomato hornworms that are ruining your tomato crop. But there's a huge warning that sometimes these organisms can get out of hand and create big problems like invasive species. So an example of that is the cactus moth was intentionally introduced for to keep the cacti in check. And the problem is now they're actually the cactus moth themselves are becoming totally rampant and taking over ecosystems and causing major problems. Another example is BT, which stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. Oh my gosh, I never say that out loud. I always just call it BT. So it's this bacteria. It's actually a naturally occurring bacteria that lives in the soil, and it produces a protein that kills lots of caterpillars and like the larvae of flies and beetle species. So because it's naturally occurring, a lot of farmers will actually use this BT. They'll spray it on their crops, and it just kills the pests that's eating their crop. Whoops. The release of these chemicals in such huge quantities, like the pesticides or herbicides, cause major problems. So they cause polluted waterways, polluted soils, atmosphere, living conditions, like literally the farmers, or I should not the farmers themselves, but the farm hands, the people working on the farm. Buildup of these harmful chemicals in the soil, which is gross, unhealthy working conditions, and the health risk of those who eat the foods, which is all of us. So there's quite a bit of data out there about the chemicals that are just on our broccoli and on our cauliflower that we're eating. I'm eating tonight. I'm steaming broccoli. So then they've probably all, unless they're organic, and they've all been sprayed with these chemicals. So alternatives to these methods is one idea is to just squash the insects yourself. I spent hours after hour after hour of flipping leaves and of one particular pest. I knew exactly what the egg looked like of that insect. Like the potato beetle has bright orange little eggs, and I would squish the eggs with my bare fingers. I'd squish the beetles with my bare hundreds, probably literally thousands in a day. By the end of the day, my hands would just be stained bright orange from squishing these insects by hand. But it was an organic alternative. A lot of people let chickens actually try to kind of run rampant through their farms to try to keep the pests in check. Another biggie is crop rotation. So it's really, it's been proven really valuable to rotate crops. So let's say you have potatoes one year in this one row, and the potato beetles find your potato crop and it's no good. If you move it to the other side of your farm next year, there is a way less chance that the potato beetles will find your new potato crops. And farmers, even just like backyard gardeners, have found some really good success with just tricking the insects year after year. And then polyculture. So poly means many. Polyculture farming is a type of farm, is a farm that grows like multiple types of things. So the picture on the right here is a beautiful example of polyculture. So you can see that in every row, it appears that they're growing different things, lots of different fruits, lots of different vegetables I can see there. And that is really valuable to the soil, to the ecosystem, for some various reasons that we'll talk about another day also. One thing that's really important to talk about with farming is pollination, right? Without pollinators, we'd have no fruits. Some of our vegetables don't require pollination. So we'll talk about that now. So remember that pollination is simply just plant sex, right? It's literally how they have sex. So without plant sex, we would have no more plants. So we love plant sex. Oh my God, that's funny. Now that is funny. So, sorry, I'm going to go back to this image. So remember, so plants, believe it or not, have male and female parts. One of like pollen is male sperm. So pollen, which right now is actually spreading like crazy. So pollen is sperm, and it's making its way currently through our atmosphere and landing on a female species of that same organism. So plants can become pollinated in a number of different ways. Some plants, like the current big pollen right now is pine trees, but pine trees just depend on wind. And that's why if you're feeling sneezy, it's because it literally depends on the pollen to be moved through wind. A lot of the food that we eat every single day is dependent upon insects to pollinate. So insects carry pollen from the male plant to the female. So with oh my God, this is so funny. So no bees equals no pollination. No pollination equals no crops. No crops equals no bread. No bread equals no garlic bread. And then he leaves. Isn't that funny? Okay. So some of the largest pollinators other than wind, remember a lot of plants really do just rely on wind to pollinate. Beetles, flies, butterflies, wasps, birds, bats, and of course bees. So bees are kind of the classic pollinator, but remember that actually lots of different species pollinate different plants. So pollinator populations are declining, and it's really terrible. So what's killing the bees? And in your notes, this is the slide I want you to write from. What are killing the bees? Some honeybee hives have been infected with mites. These mites are one of the major causes of honeybee population decline. In fact, I just talked to a local beekeeper, and he said pretty much every beehive in Ohio has these mites, just tiny little mites that kill the bees themselves. Colony collapse disorder, or we call it CCD, is another major factor. You're going to learn about that a little bit more another day. And just the use of pesticides, right? So the sprays that I talked about people using even in your backyard, I mean, anything that kills the pests on a farm is going to kill the pollinators as well. So the use of pesticides on farmers' crops have had devastating effects on the honeybee's ability to pollinate. So colony collapse disorder, like I said, you're going to learn about that more in a couple of days. But basically, because of this, we're seeing a lot of honeybees dying. So I know you're asking, but what can I do? So the two top things you could do is there are some little local classes. They're like a Saturday or maybe a Saturday and a Sunday. You could become an official beekeeper. Bee boxes are totally legal in Kettering. This picture on the bottom left is an example of a bee box. There's actually, it looks like 4 hive boxes there, but um, totally legal, totally cool. I could talk all day about bees. And then just plant native plants. So actually last night my sister bought me 4 little native plants that I didn't have. So I went out in the pouring rain last night and pulled a whole bunch of my non-native plants like hosta and sedum, some things your parents probably have in their garden. And I pulled up a whole bunch of non-native plants and planted my 4 little native plants in hopes of someday, my gardens on my home will be native and beneficial to the all the organisms in our little ecosystem here. Okay, I think that's it. So that should be it for the first section of our farming notes.